and welcome to the History Hotline, the hottest line for all things Black history and beyond. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 56 of the History Hotline. My name is Deanna Lynn Cook and I am your host today. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to yet another episode. Now, last week I talked about Barbados and the fact that they had newly become a republic and what that means for Barbados, for other countries in the Caribbean, and just for kind of the current order of the world, shall we say, in relation to British imperialism and the Queen, the Crown, the monarchy and all that jazz. Now, I didn't want to make that episode last week. Well, I did. I really enjoyed learning about Barbados and doing the research and then obviously sharing it. But my plan was actually to look at some Christmas traditions in the Caribbean and share them with you, because I don't know if you remember a few months back, I did an episode on ackee and saltfish, which is a Jamaican dish, typically eaten at breakfast, lunch, dinner, in a patty, in bread, on rice with plantain, however you want, but also for breakfast on Christmas Day. And I thought I would actually, over this Christmas period, just to kind of move away from the really racially charged, sad episodes that we've had in the past because of like looking at race relations and violence and Black people within Britain. That's the kind of narrative we always hear. So I thought it's Christmas time. I know the world isn't in the best place, but we all maybe have a happier place here. And think about some Christmas traditions around the Caribbean that may or may not be adopted by these people as they migrate to Britain. And today, as you know from the title, we're thinking about pepperpot. And in particular, I'm thinking about Guyanese pepperpot. I've never had pepperpots, but once I started researching different Christmas foods and traditions, and I stumbled upon pepperpot. First of all, I don't even eat like red meat, but my mouth was watering thinking about it. One day I might try it, but even if I don't, I just thought this just sounds delicious, and it reminded me of so many other foods within West African cooking, Caribbean cooking, the southern states of America, some of the foods they eat, like gumbo and that kind of thing. And I thought, I can kind of envision what this tastes like, and I want to talk about it, and I really want to talk about it especially because it links really interestingly with America, even though it's a Guyanese dish. And I really just wanted to kind of tie in all these links and link this food back to the movement of people from West Africa to the Caribbean around the Southern American states through, unfortunately, slavery, transatlantic slavery, but also in the aftermath of that, and how these foods have travelled and created long-lasting, really important traditions for people around the world. And before I go into that, I really wanted to, I don't know if I've said it on this podcast before, I've definitely tweeted about it. There's a food documentary on Netflix called High Off the Hog. And honestly, it's the best thing I've watched in a really, really long time. It's about like tying in Southern American food kind of greats, the staples of the diet, into countries in Africa and the kind of origins of these foods, especially West Africa. And it really does travel. That documentary, I don't know where that budget came from, but they're all over different parts of Africa, different parts of America, looking at the ways in which these foods have travelled and what they now mean to different groups of people in these regions. And it was just fascinating. It made me absolutely starving when I was watching it. Like, I had to eat like throughout it. I had to just snack because it was making me so hungry. But it was so interesting and a little step away from Caribbean and Black British history, but fascinating all the same. So that's just a plug for that. It's been on Netflix a while. It's not new, but it is sensational. So, Guyanese pepperpot. You might be thinking, well, where is Guyana? I obviously speak a lot about the Caribbean here, and Guyana is often like classed as a being in the Caribbean, but it's not a Caribbean island, in the sense of it's not part of the like Greater Antilles, the Lesser Antilles. It's actually part of the like countries, the block of countries that we would call South America. It's in that mainland of South America, the capital city being Georgetown. It's bordered by the Atlantic Ocean on the north, the Brazil to the south and southwest, and Venezuela to the west, and Suriname to the east. And Guyana is a really small area within South America. I think it's like the third smallest kind of country land block in that big block of land in South America. And I think I won't go into the history too deeply. I know I probably should, but I don't want this episode to be too long because we are thinking about the food traditions. However, I will say that the ethnic groups really give you insight into the kind of landscape of Guyana and the potential mix of cultures and peoples and histories. Now, this is from Wikipedia, I'll be very honest with you, and it's the ethnic groups from 2012. The little footnote is telling me it's from the Bureau of Statistics Guyana, retrieved August 2018. So these are statistics from 2012, taken from the Bureau of Statistics but referenced on Wiki. Just for context, so 39.8% Indian, 29.3% African, 19.9% multiracial, and 10.5% indigenous. And then in the really kind of small numbers, 0.3% European and 0.2% Chinese. And then the kind of religious mix is Christianity, Hinduism being the most, then Islam, and then atheism, and then a few other religions that make up about 2% of the other religions. So as you can see, got a lot of different kinds of people ethnically mixing together in this country, and the Indian population is the highest. I think because Guyana isn't an island in the same way that Trinidad or Barbados or Jamaica is, the history does vary. Guyana was actually colonized first by the Dutch, and then the kind of British came along and assumed control later on. But the Dutch didn't cede the area or kind of relinquish their rule or their reign or their kind of clutches on the country properly until 1814. And so they're kind of like a separate part of Guyana that was known as British Guyana. And then eventually that all kind of gains independence and becomes Guyana, spelled Guyana. I never know if it's Guyana or Guyana, so you might get both. And I'm sorry if that is incorrect, whichever one is incorrect. But I have heard both, and I don't know which is right and wrong. So, Guyana. But I do know British Guyana was what it was formerly called before independence in 1966. And then they became a republic very quickly after 1970, but remained a member of the Commonwealth. So essentially doing what Barbados did, but in 1970. So just to bring that back into conversation, this was not uncommon for those colonized by the British to become a republic. Let's just say that. Okay, and now time for the main event, the main course, the pepperpot soup. So unique foods at Christmas in Guyana. I think I'm going to go with Guyana. You know what I'm thinking about now? I'm thinking about Desmond's. If anybody hasn't watched Desmond's, they need to go and watch Desmond's. All the seasons of Desmond's. I have 2 episodes left at this point. It's a show featuring Carmen Munro, Norman Beaton, Ramjon Holder. Ramjon Holder, for anyone that is of my generation, was Crash's granddad in Tracy Beaker. But anyway, this is from the 80s, directed by Trix Worrell. It was on Channel 4, and it was about Desmond, who had a barbershop in Peckham, and it was all about the adventures of that would happen in his barbershop. And the family, him and his wife, played by Carmen Munro, were from Guyana, and he used to say Guyana. I can hear it. I can hear him saying it. And the whole kind of premise of the show is that they'd moved over, part of the Windrush generation, and he really wanted to go back. Actually, right now, Shirley, she doesn't want to go back. They're arguing about it actually in the episode I've just watched. Not to spoil it, but so that family was from Guyana, and their experience was so similar in ways to that of, say, people that came from Jamaica, Trinidad, Bahamas, Barbados, wherever else. However, the interesting thing I note was that they're always assumed to be Jamaican, just because there's a big ignorant population of British people that just assume all black people come from Jamaica, even if they're from a country in Africa and they've got an African accent. They just say, oh, we're Jamaican. So yeah, that was a tangent, but Guyana, it's in my mind, and that show's another show that you need to watch. It's on Netflix, and I think 4OD have it now. It came back during Black History Month, or when everybody was woke in 2020 and, you know, everybody was black this, black that, yay. So it was on Channel 4 then. I don't know if it's still there now, but it's definitely on Netflix. Really, really good watch. It ran from the late 80s to the early 90s. So you get kind of all the cultural references from that as well. The fashions, the jokes. It's truly, truly great. I'm saying that, and some of you've probably grown up on it. I'm sorry. Sorry to do this. Like, you know, I feel like Christopher Columbus discovering things that have already been discovered. But truly, truly, I was blown away when I first watched it last year when it went back on 4OD. Anyway, back to the pepper pot. Pepper pot is a dish derived from indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, South American regions, popular in Guyana. Traditionally served at Christmas, eaten with bread in the morning. It's a stewed meat dish, and it has very strong flavours, and we're going to get into the flavours in a minute because the flavours is the important part of this whole episode and story. Pepper pot is traditionally and normally made with beef. However, pork can be substituted or mutton, and they're the kind of most popular meats. Some have been known to use chicken, and then when I was looking at recipes for it, I found a vegetarian one as well. I'm not really sure how much that would bang, but you know, in terms of inclusive dining, then, you know, let's go with the vegetarian pepper pot. And also it is about the seasoning, so I don't really know how Guyanese people will feel about me just advocating for vegetarian pepper pot when it's actually all about the meat. But the seasonings and the special sauce that comes from one particular root vegetable / root plant thing is very important. So, the history of pepper pot in Guyana. Now, as I've mentioned, it has its beginnings as a dish with the indigenous people of the land that eventually became Guyana when it was carved up by the colonizers, as most places on this planet were. So, there is a root called cassava root, and it's poisonous, a poisonous bitter cassava root. And different groups, different indigenous groups of people separately discovered the amazing properties of the liquid extracts of this poisonous bitter cassava root, and the kind of preservative properties especially. Different groups of people discovered the liquid, which is called kada or kadakura sauce, and the sauce is used to make a dish known as tuma pot in Guyana as well. But also the Arawaks are said to have discovered the liquid called kassareep, which we now call kassareep. I don't think we called it that before. By we, I mean the indigenous people and not me. Kassareep is actually so important to pepper pot. It's like the main ingredient. It's like making curry goat without curry powder, essentially. There are two varieties of the cassava root, sweet and then the one we mentioned before, the bitter one. Because it's made from the bitter cassava root. So originally the Arawaks discarded that liquid that was extracted from the grated cassava. Cassava's it's kind of like yam. And if you don't know what yam is kind of like an extra tough potato, in my mind anyway. But cassava is used, it's in West Africa, it tends to be pounded. In like the Caribbean, say Jamaica, what do we use cassava for? Bami. A food called bami. If you don't know what that is, give it a Google. Fantastic for breakfast with yaki and saltfish. But in this case with the Arawaks, they extracted liquid from the grated cassava that they were using to make cassava flour. And eventually it was found that this dark brown liquid that resulted from the liquid being left in the sun was a natural preservative. I find it so fascinating how indigenous peoples, you think they didn't have the science and the know-how to do all these preserving, cooking, curing, helping, healing things, but they did. And it's always really cool to me what they did and how they figured that out. And always wonder, what were the bad attempts? What did they look like? What happened when it didn't go quite right and the preserving thing didn't preserve or the healing thing didn't heal? Anyway, my mind. So this substance was really useful. The Arawaks knew this. And the stage was set and ready for a dish that becomes pepper pot. So now today, kassareep is obviously not made in the same way as the indigenous people did it by hand necessarily. There are, machines, technologies, processes that are used to do this. So The bitter cassava is harvested and grated and then placed in something called a matapi, and the liquid is collected in a pail. And it takes a lot of this bitter cassava grated and then like strained to get this liquid, because cassava is really dry. There's no like liquid in. That's why I kind of said yam's like a tough potato. Potatoes have liquid in. That's why you can kind of make mashed potato quite easily. But when you pound yam, like that's a workout, and you're still, you still have to add things to it to make it liquidy, if I'm not mistaken. Whereas a potato, you can kind of mash that because it's got higher water content. Now cassava, it's got even lower water content than yam. So the amount that you're having to get, the amount of cassava you're having to use to get this liquid from it is a lot. So it would have been a very labour-intensive process for the indigenous people. Obviously now with the help of machinery, a lot easier. But each pail roughly produces like one single bottle of kasserine, apparently, because the liquid has to settle and then it's strained and then it's boiled. Now, boiling is the important part. And it's important because the bitter cassava root liquid that comes out actually contains a poisonous acetone called cyanohydrin. I hope I've said that right. A poisonous acetone called cyanohydrin. And it becomes highly toxic hydrogen cyanide on contact with water. However, for all the chemists, hydrogen cyanide is quite volatile and it evaporates really quickly when it's heated. So you don't actually have to boil it for very long because it's so volatile, it evaporates out. And then you're left with something that isn't poisonous, thank goodness. But again, when I'm thinking about the indigenous people, I'm thinking, how did they figure that out? How did they know? And how many attempts did it take before they got there? I wish I was a fly on the wall. Anyway, so you have to boil a lot of the liquid to create the kasserine, and the boiling can be done on an open fire. And I think it is said that it kind of needs a steady boiling temperature, which means it can take a few hours. And then the consistency has a kind of really thick, syrupy, molasses kind of consistency, but a sweet flavour. And then you can add different spices like cloves, salt, cinnamon, to enhance the flavour of the kasserine, depending. Now, that's the kind of process just to get this syrupy liquid to then go and make your pepper pot. So obviously you don't have to do all that. You can go to the shop and buy it. But I'm just kind of elaborating and really letting you know how much labour goes into this dish, this pepper pot, and how kind of important these processes are, and how important they would have been to the indigenous people that were first doing them, which I find very, very interesting. So in my research about kasserine, I found an article and it's talking about the kind of spike in demand for kasserine at Christmas, because obviously everyone's making their pepper pot. And some people actually manufacture it themselves. And I guess, thinking about all the technologies and things that they might need and machinery, actually it's still in some parts being done by just human hands. And the kind of knowledge and know-how that has been passed down or that they have. And there are quite a few small traders that then take the kasserine that they've made to market, because you can obviously grow cassava as a root very easily throughout the year, and then you're just essentially grating it, straining it, which is a process I think would need the most machinery, and I'm quite curious to see how you would do that kind of within your own little manufacturing process, and then boiling it, which we've said, although it's an very, very, very important part, it doesn't take too much to kind of have that poisonous chemical evaporate off the top. So yeah, it's very interesting to see that some people, to kind of aid the demand for kasserine during Christmas, will get involved and enterprise and create this product. Okay, and then the actual making of the dish, the pepper pot. In this article, it says it depends on the chef, which I'm not surprised at. Every dish, no matter how popular or how important it is going to vary family to family, chef to chef. So some people boil the meat with the kasserine and then they add the water to make the stew. Some people add the kasserine and the water after the meat has boiled. And then this chosen spices are added. Original pepper pot would have included wild meat. Obviously, it was indigenous people making it. And sometimes it still does in different parts of Guyana. However, this article is telling me that it's generally agreed that beef is the meat, but other meats or non-meats are acceptable. Chunks of beef, bones included, sometimes oxtail, cow heel, are to be used. However, and to be honest, most of the ones pictures I've seen of pepper pot, look to me like oxtail, like Jamaican oxtail with like, you can see a bone and meat falling off the bone quite softly and gently and lovely. However, tofu apparently can work. So vegans, you got something. And yeah, anybody that knows me I love tofu. So, but I literally read that tofu can be used and had to come back to this podcast to explain to you guys that we can have tofu, pepper pot tofu. So yeah, and I've seen obviously recipes with vegetables too. So very inclusive dish, and also it's eaten with bread. That's the common consensus, and cassava bread is something that sometimes accompanies pepper pot, or a store-bought bread, freshly baked bread, lots of variations, no right or wrong answers. As long as you got the cassareep, by the sounds of it, and a good blend of other spices, and a strong body, whether that be a meat, a vegetable, or a tofu, I think you're onto something. Maybe there are some hardcore Guyanese people that will be saying, no, what is this lady on about? It's beef or we die. And I will leave that in your capable hands and your opinions. I'm just telling you what I researched. So I find it very, this is going to sound strange, but I get very worried about speaking about other people's cultural dishes because I just feel there's such a reverence and importance about food. Maybe because I take, food quite seriously sometimes, especially at Christmas. It really is what it's all about for me personally. So I really am trying not to say anything that's wrong. And it seems there aren't really too many right or wrong answers. But of all the episodes I've ever had backlash for, it's for food episodes. I get many people sending me messages telling me I'm wrong. And I don't like that at all. It's not nice. It's not fun. And it's not true because, it's a dish and it's going to vary chef to chef, person to person. But now I'm talking about a food that's not within my own culture. I am trying to be very respectful to it. So please don't come for me in the DMs, the comments, please. Okay, now why pepper pot and why do I find it so fascinating? Because when I was searching for pepper pot soup came up and I'm thinking, what is the difference between pepper pot and pepper pot soup? And the pepper pot soup was coming from America and I'm thinking, what are you guys making over there? And lo and behold, they have a similar thing. They have pepper pot soup in Philadelphia, of all places. I was expecting like deep south, where slavery was really big and plantation cultures and systems are in place. But no, Philadelphia. I'm thinking, okay, that's very interesting. Philadelphia is where the founding fathers of America were, where the Liberty Bell is, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, all of that stuff happened in Philadelphia. Historically, it's a fascinating place, and I've got really good food as well. Philly cheesesteaks being one of them. Did not know about pepper pot soup being something in Philadelphia. And I was watching a video about it because, as my way in, there's a food historian and his name is Ashbel McKelvin. And he was talking about the fact that essentially pepper pot soup, from his perspective as a food historian and chef, most food historians are chefs. I've noticed that. Is it too late for me to transition? Just asking for a friend, me. But yeah, he was saying that wherever there's poor people, there is a version of pepper pot soup. He was saying the Irish have a version, people in West Africa have a version, in the Caribbean, and obviously in America, and African Americans in particular, have this version of pepper pot soup. And the version he was making had beef neck, a lot more vegetables were added, peppers, carrots, kind of giving more like a stew and something I can imagine poorer people eating essentially of, we've got these vegetables, we've got this, we're going to add this all into this stew and make this very warming dish. And I just found it so fascinating that, this had travelled to a place like Philadelphia, through the movement of people. And now it was still kind of passed on as a very traditional recipe there as well as in Guyana. And it's not a Christmas recipe in Philadelphia. It's a general day-to-day thing. And I even found an image of these alleged pepperpot women who would sell pepperpot soup from on the streets, kind of in a big cauldron type, big massive pot, and sell it to people on the street as like street food. And the comparison was made with kind of the hustlers that kind of sell in the subway or like sell street food now. And I just found it very interesting that pepper pot soup in Guyana is now anyway a Christmas tradition, something eaten in celebration. But then in America it was seen as kind of food for the poor. And obviously this has been gentrified because everything is gentrified these days, let's be honest. But yeah, it was seen in Philadelphia anyway as food that was kind of a dish made easily and quite quickly for poor families potentially, maybe with less meat, because meat we know is an expense that not all can or could afford. So I found it quite interesting and how that food has travelled through, i.e. the indigenous people, also through transatlantic slavery, because we know Guyana is the top of South America. It would have seen the same kind of indigenous people that were passing through Venezuela, going to places like Jamaica, Barbados, and other Caribbean islands as well. So it's interesting that, these kind of techniques of preserving foods, which is what the casa root was originally used for, and then obviously as a flavour for food and for dishes that are now, still amongst us today. And so I found all of this very, very, very interesting, the kind of global influence of it. And I'm sure there are people in Britain that will be eating pepperpot on Christmas Day because of later movements and migrations from Guyana to Britain. And people carry their traditions with them. I think food is one of the easiest things to hold as your culture, as long as you can get access to kind of the spices or the raw ingredients, which, if you move over in big enough numbers, you tend to be able to. So I always find it really, really cool when food traditions are able to live on and sometimes even kind of grow and adapt and change and be shaped a little bit by the new climate or the new home of said immigrant group. But pepperpot is something that I am hoping to try one day. Maybe not on Christmas, because that is literally in 2 weeks' time. I can't believe it. I mean, if you're listening to this any time after Christmas, then you will believe it, I'm sure, because Christmas will have passed. But I just, wanted to share some really cool food history over the next few weeks and Christmas traditions. Get away a little bit from the doom and gloom of British racism. I think we've seen that enough in the actual public sphere. Word to the nationality bill, which I think also is a top contender for an episode next week, because that's a scary one. That sees me in a different country for no apparent reason, and that's very scary and not okay. No. No, Britain, no. But that's for another day. We're having a break from racism today. So thank you so much for listening. If you're listening to this over Christmas, then have a wonderful and a Merry Christmas and a happy holidays to any other holidays you might be celebrating or acknowledging this year. But thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful week. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to the History Hotline. If you've enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend to tell a friend. To continue the conversation about Black history, head over to our social media platforms at the History Hotline on Instagram and at the History HL on Twitter.